Well, good morning. It's Monday, May 11th, and welcome to Coffee with Ken. I'm Ken Biberaj, a managing director at Savills, a leading tenant advisory commercial real estate firm. We're beginning week 9 of social distancing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was announced last Friday that the U.S. unemployment rate has hit 14.7%, the worst since the Great Depression, and over 20 million jobs were lost in April alone. Today's topic is the path forward, getting America back to work, and our very special guest is Suzanne Clark, the president of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
Oh, thanks for being here. I am virtually at Swings Coffee Shop. They have 2 locations in D.C. and a brewery and a roastery in Delray. So cheers to you and this morning. So you have a very exciting position, obviously, at the Chamber, but you've also started your own conversation series called The Path Forward at the Chamber. So why don't we just start right there and jump in? What is the path forward in an economic recovery from the pandemic?
Well, it's a great question, right? And so we know that when we get back to work will be determined by public health officials, but we're doing a lot of work trying to help business leaders and government leaders think about how we get back to work. And we're lucky at the Chamber because we have a unique vantage point. We represent businesses all across the country, every size, every sector, and we have thousands of state and local chambers on the ground feeding us intel as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so much of this, obviously, you understand, right? Any business's worst nightmare is uncertainty, just not being able to understand the rules of the game, how things are going to go. And this is the epitome of uncertainty, right? I mean, what are you hearing from members about, across the country, across sectors, about what they're trying to figure out right now today?
I think that's an excellent question. And it's not just businesses who loathe uncertainty, it's consumers too, right? And so a key piece of getting business going again is getting demand going again, which all gets down to confidence. And I think confidence is directly related to clarity. And so when we have clarity of information, then we can assess risk as human beings and decide what we want to do and feel good about it. But with information that keeps changing and such a new, unprecedented situation for which there's no playbook, it's really complicated. I think what we hear most from businesses across the country is that they're looking for national standards with local flexibility. They want the ability to change things based on specific conditions on the ground in their area. And the last thing they want are really heavy-handed regulations because the information is so imperfect right now, they're not sure that the government would get it right.
That's interesting. So let's unpack that a little bit, right? So what kind of national standards? Is that on testing? Is that on who's allowed to go where? What does that look like? How does that define, do you think?
I think the number one piece, you can break this down into several buckets, right? But I think one of the first pieces that's so important is the underlying essential services. You can't get back to work until the schools are open, camps are open, childcare is open. You can't get back to work until transit is functioning. I know even at the Chamber, a relatively small business in DC, one of the number one concerns of our employees is how will I get there, right? So I think the essential services piece is really important, and the concept of how does a school reopen and when does a school reopen and what's required at a school or a childcare or a camp is super crucial. I think the second bucket is around equipment, testing, more testing, immunity testing. But also, what's the right type of PPE? What should an employer be doing? We're seeing local guidelines that are different. A temperature check in one locality that's a different temperature in a different locality, which to your point doesn't give you clarity or confidence. So essential services, I think this next piece around equipment, and then I think they're also looking for some assurity that if they follow the CDC guidelines, that they're not going to be sued for reopening. That they're very concerned about the liability risks that exist when there's no playbook.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, right? So if you're an employer or you have a restaurant and you want to have customers coming in, what kind of exposure are you putting on yourself and on your business by having people come in, whether you're following the local or the federal kind of guidelines? I mean, how are folks thinking about that? I mean, we know a lot of landlords obviously are very concerned about, a tenant in the building gets it. What happens to other tenants, other employees, and how's that trickle down effect? So how are you thinking about the broader liability concerns that people have?
As you might imagine, we're spending a lot of time thinking about it. And let's be perfectly clear. Bad actors should be punished. I mean, this is a global health crisis, right? And so people who are not playing by the rules should be punished. What we're concerned about is more of a kind of temporary and targeted liability relief for people who really are trying to do the right thing, who are following public health guidance, who are following CDC guidelines, and are doing the right thing and following the right laws. But in a world where the information keeps changing, somebody still could get sick at their location, and we want businesses to be able to reopen without fear of another big economic crisis coming because of a huge lawsuit.
Yeah, and especially with all this uncertainty about a second wave or something else happens, I mean, it's all live time for everyone. Every state, I think, it has kind of, shown their own leadership, to your point, right? The federal government has kind of deferred on local government, state government to really lead the charge and to come up with the best practice on what to shut down, when to reopen, et cetera. How do you think that plays out when we're thinking of a national recovery and getting everybody kind of back to work and traveling and so on? I mean, do we need more of a kind of uniform strategy across the board, or is it better kind of have local strategies, you think?
I think it takes both, right? We do need CDC guidelines. We need guidelines coming out of the administration. I think that they have great scientists. Look at Dr. Fauci, look at Dr. Birx, really understanding the science and what's out there and how businesses should be thinking about it at a national level. But the situations are also different on the ground, and this pandemic is moving through regions at different rates. And so I think it goes back to needing federal guidelines with a lot of flexibility on the ground for local implementation. That said, we're really calling on the states. We have this task force made up of 50 state chambers where we're saying to people, this pandemic doesn't stop at a state line. So, for example, you and I are both in Northern Virginia. If the restaurants in Northern Virginia have a different set of reopening guidelines than the restaurants in DC, you could have a real problem with consumer confidence, right? Or if office buildings in Maryland have a different guideline than the office buildings in DC, and you go home and you're saying to your spouse, well, my building doesn't do that. It doesn't give the consumer and employee confidence that we really need. So we are calling on governors and state and local leaders to coordinate their responses in a way that lends clarity and confidence.
Yeah, and so much of the confidence question is a safety question, really, right? I mean, so what do you think the next 90 days to 6 months looks like from a safety perspective? I mean, numbers are still going up; they're coming down in New York, but we're a bit all over the place, if you will, right? Because everyone's kind of implemented a strategy a little differently. So, if we need confidence, safety is the kind of issue that'll hopefully get us over that hurdle. Is it just masks and gloves and separation? How do you think about addressing safety to instill confidence?
Well, even members of my family don't take medical advice from me, so I'm the last person who should talk about public health guidelines. But I would say this, as we talk to experts in consumer confidence, one of the things that they advise businesses is, of course, first of all, follow every law, listen to the experts, listen to the public health officials, but then also do things that instill confidence in your customers. Make the hand sanitizer really visible. Make your cleaning crews really visible. If you used to do it at night, you might actually want to do it during business hours right now. So you want to make your signage, how far apart people are in line. I'm sure you have tenants that are worried about elevators, how many people can be on an elevator at one time, how the queue for an elevator works, which is leading people to think about staggered hours. Is it different days of the week that office buildings might go back, or is it different hours of the day? And so I think those are things that are in businesses' control, right? The safety questions are out of our control. What is in our control is what we can do to keep our people safe.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more. So let's talk about the various sectors, right? The chambers, working to be a resource for businesses of all sizes. How do you think this pandemic's playing out? I mean, obviously it doesn't discriminate, right? I mean, it's going across all states, all sectors. Are there certain sectors you're a little maybe more concerned about, whether it's, retail, the gig economy, hospitality, trade? I mean, how are you looking at the kind of sector impact maybe a little differently on how this is playing out?
It's a smart question, because if you think about it in phases, we know that right now airlines are operating at 5% capacity, right? And we know that businesses that rely on high density, whether it's entertainment, sporting events, et cetera, it's going to be a while before they recover, before they can get back to those big numbers. They're going to need assistance longer than other types of businesses. It's part of why the Chamber's task forces are now broken into sectors, because it's just going to be so different depending on the type of business you're in. So we're worried about high density businesses quite a bit. I think as you look at the restaurants, et cetera, what does it feel like to only come back at 50% capacity? And you and I were talking in the virtual coffee shop before we started about what does it, are there restaurants that have enough real estate to create that distance, or outside space that they were already using? Yeah. They can create this. So some restaurants, et cetera, I think are going to have natural advantages to this. But the businesses that rely on volume, it's going to be complicated for a while.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it's all over the place. We had one large relief effort, obviously, with that came out of Washington, over $2 trillion. There's talk of more kind of relief efforts, further commitments to the PPP program and so on. What do you think should be happening out of Washington? Where should our lawmakers be, devoting their attention? I know there's a lot of follow-up from the density businesses, from restaurants that, they didn't maybe get the relief they were looking for in the first round. What does the Chamber think about second, third, future rounds of relief? Obviously, there's already actually been several, so that's right. The kind of cascading impact coming down this summer.
It's interesting that you mentioned the previous round, if you don't mind me taking a little bit of a long route to your question.
Yeah. Because there has been multiple, actually, right? There was like a few before the big one, so.
The Wall Street Journal had an article this weekend about the fact that this last round wasn't being exhausted as quickly as everybody thought it would. And so I was talking to some of our experts over the weekend about why is that? And it's actually for a pretty good reason, which is that in the first round of PPP funding, the average loan amount was $200,000. Last week's average loan amount was $37,000, which means it's starting to get to smaller and smaller businesses, which I think was the intent of this round. And it takes longer for those businesses and their banking relationships, et cetera.
Yeah.
And if you also look at the rules under which this was written, you have to keep your employees for 8 weeks, right, for this to turn into a grant.
Sure.
You also have people kind of waiting to the last minute, because if you're a restaurant, you don't know when you can open. You don't want to take them back only to have to lay them off again, right? So it's a really interesting piece, but I think those funds will get exhausted and it will take a phase 4 bill. We're looking for in the phase 4 bill some help for our smaller chambers of commerce, tourism boards, economic development boards. They've been hit really hard and they didn't qualify previous rounds. So that's something that we're looking at. And to your point earlier, these high density businesses are going to need assistance longer than others.
Yeah, no. I mean, I saw in New York, the New York City NYC and Company, the tourism board. I think they had some layoffs and furloughs that took place, and these are organizations that are committed to boosting tourism and hospitality, and so much of that is tied to travel. So a lot of that also, obviously, with New York as a place that would get $8 billion a year in economic activity from tourism and 60 million visitors, losing that is going to be a pretty massive impact on the broader economy, not only to New York, but across the country. Right. How does the Chamber think about the global impact of all this, right? Like this is one of these things that it's not just states, not localities, not the U.S. This is a global thing. And if we can't have visitors from around the world coming, that's going to continue to kind of have a trailing impact. So how are you thinking about the global kind of effort to get back some confidence?
It's interesting. You probably saw the pictures this morning of Shanghai Disney opening, right? And we're all watching how that's working and looking. Last week, we did an event with some people on the ground in China, on the ground in Germany, just to talk about what can we learn from other countries that are in different stages of this? So if we get back to the path forward and the chamber trying to get people back to work, one piece is there are a lot of businesses that never left, right? Essential businesses, et cetera, that have been open the whole time. And we have countries that are further along in the process than we are. So we're studying what we can learn from both sides to see how that help us open faster. So in that way, the global connection, I think, has been really helpful. I think as you look forward to kind of what happens next, I think this communication, the relationships we have with governments and businesses overseas are going to be more important than ever. And I think what we're going to see coming out of this is going to be a whole examination of the supply chains, the trade routes, what does it mean, what should we make where, et cetera. So there's kind of the short run, medium run, and like long-term global aspects that I think are going to really have hard looks. We're going to take hard looks at them after this is over.
Yeah. Well, you kind of alluded to this, right? The chambers have this unique kind of nexus point. You have these global relationships. You obviously have the domestic relationships at 50 states, all the chambers there, all the businesses across, and to government and to leaders, right? So you're well positioned to kind of be this coordination point, I think, with, businesses and government. How are you viewing maybe the chamber's role today versus maybe, 7-8 weeks ago, right? I mean, you're at this kind of nexus point, I think, where, to the previous part of the conversation, businesses need to have confidence and do what's right within their four walls and make decisions, but government also has a huge role in kind of, ensuring that we're operating in a safe kind of more coordinated manner. So how do you view your role at the chamber today? Maybe more important than usual, huh?
Well, I think it's just, if you look at the chamber and its 120-year history or something, it's always been about waking up in the morning and helping job creators, waking up in the morning to help economic growth, right? There's a core belief system that Republicans, Democrats alike who work at the chamber believe, which is that a job really matters to a family, that a job really matters to a community. And so the family is better off, a community is better off when it has higher employment rates. And so whether it was through the Great Depression or World War II or anything else that's faced this country, the chamber has stood there and said, how can we help government and help business get to jobs and economic growth? So in some ways, there's no change, right? That's always been our mission. And having that North Star is super helpful when things get complicated. But right now, I know there's not one employee at the chamber who doesn't know exactly what they're doing and why, and that mission matters. So it's very unifying. But I think to your point, there's suddenly a kind of laser-like focus instead of on 300 different issues on the dozen most important. Right? Nothing clarifies the mind like a good crisis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and we were talking about this a little earlier before we got started, but how important work is, not only for working families from an economic standpoint, but also really from a healthcare standpoint. I mean, so what are you seeing as kind of like the other kind of ancillary negative factors that are coming out of this? Obviously, like the ability to have healthcare. I mean, so many people rely on their employers. I mean, so what are you seeing in terms of support for working families and some of your efforts?
We're spending a lot of time thinking about this because the news tends to talk about either people are focused on stopping the pandemic or they're focused on getting back to work, as if it's not a big ecosystem, right? As if there aren't really big employers who are working on the vaccines and the testing and the PPE, et cetera. And if there aren't small businesses that are supplying those large businesses, and it's a big ecosystem. It's hard to separate it out. And in particular, you're mentioning an important part of that ecosystem, which is the role a job plays in a community's health. Access to good food, access to medicine, access to insurance, et cetera. We know that health outcomes can correlate with employment numbers in a community. And so what we don't want to do is we don't want to sacrifice the jobs and the economy for health and then lose health anyway, right? So how do you do this in a lockstep way where we're really focused on protecting public health, but also getting Americans back to their paychecks?
Yeah. So, on these talks, there's so many challenging things we're dealing with, but we also like to try to find a silver lining and then some signs of optimism, right? So we're in this situation where obviously the entire economy has kind of shattered. and people's lives have been devastated, and we're dealing with the real life health impact and so on. But what are some potential silver linings related to maybe job growth, the economy, maybe rethinking some things that have kind of been operating as status quo? And I'm kind of getting at, this post-crisis policy planning, right? Like, what should we be thinking about right after this, like we had after 9/11 or after the Great Recession? Like, what is this moment? How should we kind of all galvanize together and make our country and our economy stronger and work better for more people after this?
Well, let me try to answer. I think there were two questions there. Let me separate them out for a minute. I want to do the post-pandemic piece and then the optimism piece. I think so. As we thought about our work at the Chamber, the first piece was how many families and communities could we help get through the public health crisis and the economic crisis? What was emergency aid, emergency help, emergency supplies, anything that we could do to help through the public health and economic crisis? The second phase that we're in now is really about how can we help people get back to work? What does that look like? We talked about some of those aspects. And then the third bucket of work at the Chamber is how do we prepare for this post-pandemic world? You pointed out after 9/11, we had terrorism risk insurance, we had the TSA right after the Great Recession, Dodd-Frank, the CFPB. So we know when this is over, there'll be a rush to legislate, litigate, regulate, and we want to be ready for that, right? And so what does that look like in a way that doesn't stagnate the economy, but is really helpful in protecting public health? And I think that you're right, that one of the things this has pointed out is this big digital divide. And so in a world where there are a lot of predictions now that what would have taken 5 to 10 years to go virtual has suddenly gone virtual overnight. And it points out that a number of people are left behind from that. And so what do we do? How do we come together and innovate? And that lets me bring up your optimism, right? Which is, I never ever bet against American ingenuity and innovation and America's entrepreneurs, and seeing what they bring out of this, how school is disrupted, how childcare is disrupted, how work is disrupted, and maybe in one old-fashioned way, in that we're seeing an older generation of people adapt to virtual work in a way we weren't sure they ever would. But we're also seeing a younger generation value face-to-face in a way that we thought never would, right? My own teenager is saying, Mom, the screen just isn't the same, right? It's just not the same. I want to see my friends. So I'm optimistic, too, that the generations come together in a way that maybe we didn't know how to get to before.
Well, that's a great segue to how is work going to be different, you think? I mean, how we do a lot of, office leasing and real estate, and we're dealing with a lot of companies that are thinking through what is the future, right? Is there going to be a need for as much office space or, event space and so on? So how are you thinking work maybe changes or evolves after this?
I'm really interested in studying that. And I think you're going to have to come and help the Chamber think about this a little bit.
Anytime.
Right now, I don't know what you're hearing. I'd love to hear about it. We're hearing almost both ends of the spectrum. Again, I think in an imperfect world where this is so unprecedented, people don't know. But we're hearing from some people saying, wow, virtual work was a lot more possible than I thought. Maybe some of the big accounting consultant or whatever firms saying, why do I have all this real estate when we're usually at the clients anyway? On the other hand, you're seeing people say, oh my gosh, I reduced my footprint so much that now I can't socially distance. And so how do I create room in this moment? And I can't tell what will be short-term versus long-term, how it plays out. But I think we've got to turn our attention to that next. Yeah,
and I think there's going to be a lot of desire and strategic thinking about just culture and creating your own community within a company. So a lot of Zoom meetings and all of this has been fantastic, but I think, a lot of people are looking forward to getting back and socializing. And, obviously I think that's something that's happening across the country with states slowly opening up and people wanting to get back out there. How are you kind of cautioning or advising people? I mean, is there a push from your perspective to open quick, kind of continue to be process oriented? I mean, what's your kind of take as we enter the summer, where there's probably a natural inclination to just get out more and maybe travel or, visit some old places?
Again, we have to follow what the public health officials are telling us, but we know
Yeah.
that sector specific, it'll be really different. A manufacturing facility is really different than an office, is really different than a restaurant, right? And how much square footage you have, how much outside space you have. I mean, we were interviewing some doctors last week who said on one of our programs that the risk of outdoor transmission seems to be quite low. Right? So anything that you can do outside feels logical. People are more worried about elevators, right, and confined spaces. And so I think it's just going to be really different for each place. And so we're really encouraging our members to tell us what their big issues and concerns are, and listening to the members who never closed about what has worked and what hasn't, and sharing those best practices. And then, as I mentioned earlier, trying to create some very temporary targeted liability relief, so people who do try to implement an imperfect playbook aren't incented not to, and to just stay closed until they have perfect information, because I don't think that day is going to exist.
Yeah. So let's last question. We'll kind of give an audience question, kind of asking about the role of states, and there was some concern, obviously, about state budgets and municipal budgets, and how devastated they have been, and they have to balance budgets every year. How are you thinking through that side of the equation? And, obviously there was, I think, reference that some states might need to file for bankruptcy or something. I mean, so many businesses and communities rely, obviously, on their local government and some of these resources. So how are you thinking through that impact as well? I mean,
it's something we're listening to our state and local chambers on the ground about. But I will tell you, in a broader sense, I was asked recently, gee, the chamber is supporting these trillion-dollar aid packages, but usually you're so against rising deficits. How do you square the two? And I would say, whether you're in a state or whether at the federal level, this is why you should have fiscal prudence on a regular day, so that when the rainy day comes, you can deficit spend, right? When you're just deficit spending in the good times, it doesn't leave you the fiscal tools you might need when the bad days come. And so we're seeing some states that were in a lot of trouble before this. We're pretty really fiscally managed before this. And so it just shows you the importance of being well run, because when a crisis hits, it makes it even harder to recover.
Nice. So but before I let you go, what's coming up on your next virtual talk? So it's called The Path Forward, and folks can go to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce website, I think, to tune in and find out more. But what are you talking about over the next couple of weeks?
We've done a Harvard epidemiologist, we've done transit, we've done childcare, we've done global lessons, and I think we're starting to drill down a little tighter into testing and equipment, into schools. We did childcare, but we didn't really do schools, and I think we're starting to hear more and more about that from business leaders who are concerned that school plans are going to be really one of the most important drivers here. And so we'll continue to drill down into what different office spaces best practices look like, high density businesses. I think this week's program, Thursday at 3, is on high density businesses, what's going to happen in restaurants, what's going to happen in casinos, et cetera. And clearly we're going to have you on to talk about the impact on
anytime. I'll bring my own coffee whenever you need.
Perfect.
Well, Suzanne, thank you so much for being on. We're always so grateful by the support of the chamber and the work you're doing and your team's doing every single day. It's going to be a long haul, and we're all in it together. So as much coordination as we can have in our communities, with government, and with our businesses is going to be needed. So thank you for being here on Coffee with Ken. Our next Coffee with Ken is going to be this Wednesday, May 13th, with Joe Andrew, the global chairman of Denton's Law Firm. Stay home, stop the spread, save lives, and hopefully we'll all get back to work in some sense of normalcy soon. Suzanne Clark, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good to see you.